So I have the great pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Nellie McKesson. Nellie has been working in publishing for well over a decade in almost every book production role there is, production editor, print layout specialist, ebook production manager, just to name a few. She spent the last 6 years or so working specifically on automated workflows, creating ebook and print files via hands-off automated tool chains. In late 2017, she founded the startup Hederis, whose goal is to solve publishing problems through user-focused automation and web technology. She currently lives in Portland, Oregon, where she mostly works and plays D&D, which sounds pretty great. So please welcome to the stage Nellie McKesson.
So I'm really glad to be presenting after Dave because he actually did a really great introduction to a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to deviate away from packaged EPUB a little bit and talk about putting books directly in the browser. I should have something for everyone in this talk. I'm going to complain a lot about e-reading systems. I'm going to talk about some pretty geeky theory type things. And I'm just going to show some fun demos of what people are doing today. So just a brief intro to what pagination in the browser is before we dive into some background. Pagination in the browser literally just means putting paged content in a web browser. There we go. All right, so here's sort of an example of what we're talking about. This is just a paged book right in the browser. You can see it's chunked into these nice little pages. This is a chapter from Moby Dick. So to a lot of people, putting paged content is kind of a no-brainer. It doesn't really look like anything super exciting. Obviously, this should be something that exists. We're so used to seeing paginated things, and the internet is so well established that it's kind of inconceivable that this is still relatively new. So to better understand why this is so revolutionary, I'm going to dive into a little bit of background, hopefully not overlap too much with what Dave talked about. So to be clear, the idea of books in browsers is not new. There are lots of full books up on the internet right now. It's just that most of them exist in the traditional internet long scroll. All the content is just in one big scroll. It's not paged in any way. So, as Dave said, books on browsers, that's been a thing for a while. But it was really the introduction of ebooks and packaged digital formats that led to this expanded interest in digital publishing and reading. In 2006, we got the Sony Reader. In 2007, we got the first real EPUB spec. Hopefully that date is right. And then in 2007, we also got the first Kindle from Amazon. And that was when ebooks really started to explode. In 2009, we got the Barnes & Noble Nook. And then it wasn't until 2010 that Apple released the first iPad and iBooks. So if we look at what is out there today, every ebook reader that has ever existed, this is just a Wikipedia page that lists all the ebook readers. It's a lot. There's a lot of different ebook readers out there. A lot of them no longer exist. But if you just scroll through, at one point in time, there were a lot of different companies grappling for this ebook reading space. And each of these ebook reading systems was essentially a brand new browser with different varying levels of support for standard CSS that was being used on the web. And the CSS that companies chose to include was just what they thought was important for book reading and how much their developers wanted to build. So I'm going to focus specifically on the ebook readers that were out in 2012, which is quite a few. And the reason we're looking at 2012 is because that was when I was managing the ebook development program at O'Reilly. So I always try and use my own stories to illustrate this stuff. So 2012 was 7 years ago, which is a long time. But this point is actually still very relevant today. O'Reilly, if you don't know it, they are a reference publisher. They were the people who founded the TOC conference that Laura mentioned in her intro. They publish books about very geeky stuff like computers, coding languages, some math and analytics stuff. So we were dealing with content across a really broad spectrum of topics and code in pretty much every coding language that was out there, and also math and chemistry and just about any technical topic that you can think of. So part of our team's job was to go through every customer complaint that we got on every ebook distribution platform, which primarily came from Kindle and iBooks because those were the biggest platforms, but there were a few others too, and see what files people were complaining about, and then try to make some kind of fix in our tool chain to fix whatever problem the person was complaining about on whatever device they happened to be using. Which was kind of a nightmare because a lot of times we didn't really have a ton of data around what specific model of device they were using or what specific version of an app they were using. So we had to load our fixed file onto all the devices in our device library, see if we could replicate the error in the first place, and then if we could, see if we could make a fix that didn't then break things in other devices. So it was a real nightmare. So the result was that we put together this one big generalized ebook template that was optimized to work on as many devices as possible. So I've got a picture of the one ring, but it was one CSS template. And this template was pared down as much as possible purely for the purposes of not breaking and not generating more complaints, and being somewhat adaptable to various screen sizes and platforms. I also headed up a similar project in more recent years over at Macmillan Trade in the US to develop a similar universal CSS template for some of their EPUBs. So this was trade content. It was less complex than O'Reilly's content. But we still would get customer complaints about things breaking in our CSS, and we'd have to go back into our CSS and try and fix it. So it was really the same process as for our technical O'Reilly content. The landscape has certainly gotten better since then, but support is still a thorn in a lot of developers' sides. I just did a quick tweet the other day just to see if anyone had any stories that just popped into their head, and I got one from Kevin and one from Zia about RGBA colors and about math, which are two great examples of things that people still struggle with in ebook reading systems today. And you've still got people out there using these old devices that they bought 10 years ago that you're trying to support with your files. So this really puts publishers in the same position as software developers, where they have to say that they only support certain platforms and certain operating systems for their ebook files. I'm not quite ready to jump into the details of pagination in the browser, but I will point out that a big reason that you see so many apps moving onto the cloud these days is to solve those kinds of support issues. So developers only have to manage one code base that they push out to everybody. And it makes it a lot easier to support rather than trying to support different operating systems and versions. Okay, so if we look at the device landscape today, what we're seeing is that the way that people read is still changing, and that shift that really started in 2006, or really started gaining momentum in 2006, hasn't completely settled yet. I'm not a business analyst, but I am going to present some numbers that seem pretty significant even to me. So the first thing that we see is that people aren't buying as many reading-specific devices. This is a chart of Kindle unit sales over a few different years. In 2010, Amazon sold 10.1 million Kindles, and the Kindle was only about 63% of the total e-readers that were shipped. By 2011, those numbers had more than doubled to 23.2 million Kindles. And then in 2006, there was this drastic decline down to 7.1 million Kindles. It's harder to find unit sales for the Nook, but based on BNN financial reports, we know that Nook sales decreased by about 23.9% from 2017 to 2018, and that's following a previous decrease from 2016 to 2017 of about 23%. relatedly, there was a Pew survey in 2015 that found that only 19% of US adults owned an e-reader, pretty uniformly spread across sex, location, and age. But e-reader device makers are still making devices in spite of all of those numbers. In 2017, both Amazon and B&N released new e-reading devices. We had the Kindle Oasis and the Nook Glow Light 3. And Amazon released a press release in 2018 that said, essentially, this past Prime Day was the best day ever for Kindle sales, both in the US and globally. So there are still people out there that are buying devices specifically for reading books. If we do jump over and look at book unit sales, though, so the green bars here are print unit sales, and the white little sections are ebook unit sales. You can see that there is a healthy segment of people who have adopted the ebook reading format, but print is still doing great. In fact, print sales are increasing. There's a lot of reasons for that. Book sales trends are really complicated, and there's plenty of people probably in this room who devote their careers to analyzing this type of data. So I'm not going to suggest that it's one simple factor behind these numbers. Pricing is certainly a factor. Ebook prices have increased somewhat to be somewhat commensurate with print pricing. But I would wager that the reading experience is also a huge factor. It was interesting to me to hear Rachel Comerford say that PDF continued to be the more popular format at Macmillan Education. That was also something that we found to be true at O'Reilly for a long time. And my guess is that it's because it was a cleaner and more beautiful reading experience. It was much easier to parse visually than ebooks, where you're not really sure what you're going to get and what your students or readers are going to get. The problem is not that you can't create beautiful layouts with HTML and CSS. It's that the varying degrees of device support leave you with one hand tied behind your back. So for me, all of this data says that we, the bookmakers, are still kind of looking for the way that we fit in digitally, in a way that benefits both authors, bookmakers, and readers. People spend tons of time on the internet. This is a report from Hootsuite. There's a lot of bars here. If you can find the one for the USA, you can see that people spend over 6 hours every day on the internet on average. I think Canada is a little better, almost 6 hours. And France, they're doing great. They've only got like 4.5 hours or something. And there's this slight shift away from tablets as a browsing device. So you've got lots of people looking at the internet on their laptops and desktops, lots of people looking at the internet on their phones. Not a huge chunk of people looking at the internet on their tablets, though. Okay, so to sum all of this data up, you've got a bunch of people out there with older devices. You've got some people out there with new devices. You've got a majority of people out there who are looking at the internet a lot on their phone or tablet or computer, but no device devoted specifically to reading. You've got lots of people spending a lot of time on the internet. You don't want to lose your readers who have switched over to digital. And you do want to gain those readers who are already digital but maybe haven't really realized how great books are yet. So this really creates a landscape that is ripe for experimentation. As Dave was saying, things are technologically in a place where we can experiment quickly and try out new things to capture this digital market. All right, so we're going to segue into actually looking at pagination in the browser now. We're looking for a digital publishing model that readers are willing to pay for to keep us in business. And in order to experiment quickly and efficiently, we need a book production workflow that isn't going to bankrupt us, that allows us to experiment quickly and try publishing in different formats in different places. So In addition to having full control over your book's layout and design, this is also about finding ways to expand your market and move faster. When it comes to platforms for reading or showcasing content, putting your books in the browser has some pretty clear benefits. You've got full CSS support, which means you can make really beautiful digital books almost on the same level as print books. And there is a caveat to that full support that we will get into in a minute. You can also render complicated things like math and accurate colors. And it's really easy to update, especially if you're hosting your content from a single database and then pushing it out to a web reading system. You can make updates in your content in one place and push it out, and everyone gets the most updated file all the time. The really exciting possibility for me is actually using the browser to create your book files, especially your print files. I am a bookmaker, first and foremost, and I actually gave a talk at eBookCraft in 2017 about book production tool chains built around HTML and CSS. I'm not going to give that talk again today. This was a chart that was from that talk where you start with your HTML files, you combine them with CSS, and put them through a tool like this tool called Prints to create a PDF file. And then at the same time, you take that HTML and you write some scripts to turn it into EPUB and then into whatever other format you might need. I would say at this point, HTML and CSS are pretty well-established, viable tools for making books. There are lots of big companies that are following workflows like this and using HTML and CSS to create ebook files and print files. These kinds of workflows have historically relied on these special pieces of software, like this software called Prints, that can take HTML and CSS and translate them into laid-out PDFs. And these workflows rely on the CSS3 paged media spec, which is a special subset of CSS3 that has a lot of properties just for creating paged files. So it has things like setting trim marks on your PDFs, or setting your trim size, or setting running headers and page numbers and that sort of thing. The automated workflow like that is fast, and it can make nice-looking books, especially ebooks, but it doesn't give you the same visual control over your print output that InDesign-based workflows have. So for example, you can't just adjust the number of lines on a page by dragging a box up and down. You have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get those kinds of page tweaks to happen. I'm, again, not going to dive too deeply into this because it's a whole talk of its own, and it's a talk I've given in the past. And I've got some of those talks posted on my website. You're welcome to go look at them, and I'm always happy to talk about it. Okay, what browser-based pagination does is it actually opens up that layout process to us. So instead of having this invisible black box that we have to put our HTML into, we actually have visual control over the print layout process in the browser using HTML and CSS. So you can see exactly how things are going to look, and you can adjust your content as needed. And then from a digital reading standpoint, it allows you to present readers with beautiful print quality layouts in digital form. All right, we're going to dive into the truly geeky stuff, if you didn't think that was already geeky. So to do browser-based pagination, you need to get your content into HTML. Once again, I am not going to dive into how to do this. Please feel free to come and find me and ask me about ideas for how to make this happen. EPUB was a really huge step in that direction because we started getting this critical mass of content already in the HTML format. And of course, HTML is the language of the web. So publishers started to get used to marking up their content with HTML. So the logical progression from a developer standpoint is to just have your paged content right in the browser. And browsers are perfectly set up for displaying HTML. So this is just a screenshot of the CSS3 paged media spec. So this is what really allowed us to create pagination in the browser. These new rules made it a lot easier to build browser-based pagination scripts. Not because browsers support these rules. On the contrary, most browsers have no support for most of the CSS3 paged media spec. But what it did was it gave developers this clearly defined set of rules that they could follow to build their own pagination systems, so that they could focus just on the technical aspects of getting pagination to work, and they didn't have to think through all the complex logic of how things should work. So there are two main philosophies right now around paginating content. There's the column method and the box method. I have a very clear favorite, and it seems like most of the other devs in this space have also come to the same conclusion. But I'm going to show you both to save you some trouble if you ever want to go down this road. We'll start by looking at the column method. So there are ebook reading systems today that actually use the column method already. And it makes sense in theory. So you basically split your content into a series of columns. So what we have here is a big chunk of Moby Dick, and it's split into 4 different columns. And then in the ebook reading system, they set their viewport to display only 1 or 2 columns at a time. And the benefit of this method is that you can really quickly reflow your content as it changes. So here is where that screenshot came from. So I set content editable on this HTML, so I'm just going to type a bunch of nonsense until we can trigger reflow. Here we go. There we go. So you can see that, hopefully you saw that all the lines sort of shifted down once I reached the point where reflow was necessary. So that's, this column support is just built into the browser. The browser knows how to split things into columns, and it's automatically going to flow your content between those columns, no matter what's in that content. You can see that this is great for e-reading systems because people are constantly updating their font size or whatever other options the ebook device, e-reader device gives them, so they can quickly reflow the book as needed. Where the column method gets tricky is with basically anything that has to do with spacing or positioning content on the page. So for example, if you're adding things like margins around the pages, or dealing with things like footnotes, or anything that needs to have a fixed size in a fixed position on a page. So this is just a print spread. It's got some running headers, it's got running footers with page numbers, and it's got a footnote on the second page. Page margins are especially important here when you're talking about true, page margins, yeah, are especially important when you're talking about true book-like pagination. So these are actually defined as part of the CSS page media spec. And the spec is kind of wordy, but the concept is really simple for anyone who's ever dealt with print layout. Basically, if you think about your page as a collection of boxes, you've got your main content box, which is where your actual book text goes. And then you've got a variety of possible margin areas around the edge that you can put other content in, which is usually used for running headers and running footers. So at a minimum, you have 8 areas like this. But you have the option of using up to 16 margin areas. And you can fill each of those areas with different content, design it totally differently, give each margin area a different background color or something. So if we're talking about the column model, the way it works is that each column represents the content area for a page. And then you actually have to draw additional boxes around each column to represent those margin areas. So what we're seeing here is a single column with the margin areas drawn around it. And those are highlighted in green just to show you where they are. So you could do this either on a page-by-page basis. For example, if you only need to display a couple pages at a time, as an e-reading system might. Or you could do it all at once. For example, if you're printing all of your pages to a PDF, and you want all of the pages to look exactly like they would in the print layout. Things start to get tricky when you start introducing variable elements. So a really simple one is having different inside and outside margins. This is a super standard print layout thing where you have your inside margins a little bit wider or thinner than your outside margins. So in the standard English language book layout, if you think of your columns as pages, the odd-numbered columns would be right-hand pages, the even-numbered columns would be left-hand pages. And then you think about the column gap, which is that gap between each column, as the sum of the margin widths. So you're actually dealing with a few different column gap requirements when you're dealing with those differing margin values. You have one value for the inside margins on a spread, and then a different value for the transition between spreads. Unfortunately, this column gap is controlled by CSS, and in CSS, it's only possible to have a single column gap value for a set of columns. So there's no real way to do what we're seeing here, unless you do a bunch of fancy scripting and maneuvering and jumping through hoops. This gets even more complicated when you introduce the idea of different master pages. So I'm borrowing this term from InDesign, master pages, which essentially means that you have a bunch of page templates for different sections in your book. So a really simple version would be that you have one master page for front matter sections that uses Roman numerals for the page number, and then a different master page for main chapters that uses a decimal number. When you're working with the column layout, you need some way to detect whether the content you're working with is inside a front matter section or a chapter in order to display the correct master page with the correct margin boxes. But HTML does not have great ways to target columnar content or to figure out where things are within a column spread. So to work with columns, you need to do a lot of calculating locations and figuring out what's visible in the current column that you're looking at. So I'm going to overwhelm you with what some of this looks like to show you how complicated it is. So the solution is you use a scripting language like JavaScript to figure out the positions of various things. So you figure out the position of all of the content, with the width of all of the content, and then divide that by the width of one column, and that's how you know how to calculate where your pages are. And to figure out where a specific page is, whether it's an even page or an odd page, you have to do more math to figure out where it is in the width of the whole column spread, and then divide that by the width of a column. And then you have to look at the column, at the content that's visible in whatever column you're trying to look at, and say, what kind of container is this content inside of? If it's a front matter container, then adjust my margin content accordingly. This is all just to illustrate that, yes, this is very complicated and hard. And then where the column method completely falls apart is if you have a book that has pages with different sizes. This is pretty rare, but it is not unheard of. We definitely ran into this at least once at O'Reilly. There's no way to set columns with differing widths using standard CSS column handling. And I'm sure there probably is a way to make this happen, but it would involve some pretty clever scripting. All right, so now we will enter the box method. The box method takes your single flow of HTML and re-chunks it into page-sized chunks. So what you're looking at here is a big blob of HTML. It's inside of a section container with an EPUB type of chapter, and it's got a heading and some paragraphs. So in the box method, instead of having this one big continuous flow, you have a bunch of chunks that each have duplicates of all of the parent containers that you had in that one big chunk. So here we have a bunch of little HTML files. Each of them has that section parent container, and then each of them has a subset of the paragraphs that were inside of that section. So duplicating these parent containers is an essential part of making sure that each page chunk has all of the information that you need to correctly display each page. And this kind of information means the same things that we talked about with the column method. So knowing whether this is a front matter section or a chapter section, for example, knowing which master page to apply to this little chunk of content. And all of the instructions that you need for picking that sort of thing are right here in each chunk, totally contained. So you don't really have to do much searching to find it. The pages themselves are set up in a way that the DOM understands. So the DOM, the document object model, it basically just means the relationships between different elements in your HTML. So some elements are inside of other elements. Some elements are next to other elements. That's the DOM. In the box method of pagination, you've got discrete elements inside of other discrete elements, and then you do things with your elements based on those nested relationships. That's just HTML 101. So the box method is just dealing with HTML in the same way that people are used to dealing with it. It makes it really simple to lay out your pages. The hardest part of the box method is all up front. It's just getting your content chunked into those little pages. As with the column method, this involves some pretty intense scripting and calculating various locations, but it pretty much all happens right at the beginning, and then you can easily work with your content in those page chunks. The general idea is that you take your rendered content, so rendered means it has all of the design stuff applied to it, so that you know exactly how much space each thing needs to take up on the page. And it's truly reflective of how things are going to look and where things will sit on a page. You take this rendered content and you try to fit it all into a page container. The page container already has all the margins applied to it. And then you figure out if all of this content fits onto the page. If it doesn't, you figure out where it stops fitting. And then you break it off right there, create a new section container for your content, and create a new page and throw it into the next page. And you keep doing that over and over and over until you have pages for all of your content. Once you've got your content chunked, you need to repeat that process anytime something changes. So anytime there's a design change or a text change that affects the amount of space that elements take up, you need to rerun your pagination script to make sure that your content is still correctly chunked into pages. So this is just an example of that. So on the left side, you have some content that is, the main text is just 14 points, and then on the right side, the main text is 16 points. So you can see once I made that type change, our content is now overflowing from our page container. So we need to re-chunk our content so that it fits. This is why the column method works great for e-reading systems, because those kinds of changes happen all the time, like I said. So they need to be able to do this really quickly, whereas when you're working with boxes, it takes a second to re-chunk everything into pages, and that's just too much of a delay for a lot of readers. If you are dealing with content changes, like adding text to something, this also means that you need to make sure that those content changes are getting made in your original source block of HTML every time you rechunk, or recompiling those little pages into one big block, and then again, rechunking that into little pages. So if it is not clear by now, I prefer the box method. The column method is, again, great for reflow, but it makes intricate layout harder. The box method, because it's set up as these mini DOM chunks, is actually really easy to manipulate and adjust and lay out as pages. And the speed of reflow is something that good programmers can work around, as I am about to show you in some demos of some things that already exist. So I'm about to do a bunch of live demos. Let's hope that nothing blows up. So one of the first tools that tried to do pagination in the browser was ViblioStyle. They had some organizational changes recently and split off into a couple different organizations. But the main open source part of their tools is still called ViblioStyle, and they have some open source things that you can play around with. All right, so this is their open source reader. And basically what it does, I'm just going to take an HTML file that's hosted on GitHub, and I'm going to put it in here. And you can see it pages it nicely. It's just reading, oh, right. It's just reading CSS that's attached to that HTML file. So if I were to update that CSS, then I'd need to refresh this, and it would show those changes. It has decent support for CSS paged media. I haven't done a lot of extensive testing with it. I know there are people who have. I think Svea from Wiley has talked with them a bunch and might be able to speak better to where this specific tool stands today. A more recent tool that was created for pagination in the browser is called Calibrio Reader. Calibrio actually started out by focusing on their pagination script. And at least back when I talked to them a year ago, they were using the box method and had some special magic to make reflow super fast. So I'm just going to show you a quick demo video that Lars made for us of Calibrio in action. So he's just paging through a book file that's been paginated with Calibrio. You can see that there's a weird break between a figure label. So he's going to go into the Calibrio code and try to adjust the rules around where breaks are allowed. So this is something that's built into Calibrio that lets users adjust, or users as in you, the developers, not the people reading the book. But it lets you adjust the rules around what things are allowed to break on a page. And he has created a lightning-fast reflow script. So when you do make those changes, it reflows super quickly to show you the changes that you wanted to make. All right, that's enough of that. Calibrio is set up as an SDK, which means that it can be plugged into other people's tools and websites. So one example of someone who's using it in their tools is this company, Circular Software, who has this new product called Masterplan. So they built this way to build page-by-page previews that publishers can host on their own site. And actually, they added some additional functionality on top of Calibrio to let you lock down which pages users see and which pages they don't see. Another browser-based pagination toolset is called paged.js. And this was created by the folks over at pagedmedia.org. They actually have a bunch of different book-based open source tools that publishers can use, and Page.js is probably the newest one. It's an open source JavaScript library for pagination in the browser. Of the tools that we're talking about today, this is the one that I'm most familiar with and that I actually use in my own work. They use the box method as well for paging content, and they have some built-in functionality to make reflow pretty fast when you make changes. So this is actually the file that I showed you at the very beginning of this talk. This is paged with page.js. This content has also been set to be content editable. So let's see, we'll add some stuff here. And we'll try and trigger reflow. And you can see that it reflowed the pages. So it's pretty fast, pretty responsive to content changes. Page.js is a pure script library. So it's not something like Vivio style where you can just sort of play with a nice UI. It's a scripting library that you have to plug into another tool. But for the developers out there, it is a pretty concise library. It's relatively easy to plug into your tools. As with all of these things, the Page.js folks have included support for a lot of the things from the CSS paged media spec, and they are still working on it and still adding support for things as needed, and are very open to suggestions. So you can write CSS for your books that conforms to that spec, and Page.js will actually parse it automatically and apply it to your books. We actually use this in our tools at Hederis. We built our own pagination script at the beginning, but they have much better developers focusing just on this, so I'm always happy to let people do work for me. So here's a quick example of the kinds of things that you can do with Page.js and pagination in the browser when it comes to layout. So this is just a demo that I whipped up for you guys. You can see you've got your paged content in the browser. You can click on something and then adjust design things, like we just centered the chapter header there. You could adjust the font if you want to. We'll do that one. Not a huge difference, but it's a difference. And then it repages your content and shows you exactly how the print file is going to look when you print it to a PDF. So pagination in the browser really opens up opportunities like this for laying out print content right in the browser and having true WYSIWYG control over your files. Okay, so what's next? That's a very fast, possibly overwhelming intro to pagination in the browser. I've only been talking about pure pagination issues. When it comes to viewing books in the browser, there's a lot of other things that you have to take into account that Dave also mentioned in his talk earlier. Things like tables of contents, reading order, metadata, all the kinds of things that EPUB has already thought about and for the most part figured out. So the EPUB spec is a great place to look for inspiration when you're building these kinds of tools. And I think Dave mentioned this also, that they're already thinking about specs for book content on the web. So this is a screenshot of the packaged web publication spec. And there are people thinking about what those rules need to be, like what rules need to exist around books on the web and reading on the web, and what kinds of extra things need to be added. When you're using pagination in the browser for book production to create print PDF files, you can use most of these tools to create your layouts in the browser and then print those to a PDF. There's some other tools that you can use to do that in a scripted way. But you do need to do a little bit of extra work after the fact to make your PDFs compliant to your printer specs. That's something that's built into tools like InDesign and Prints that browsers don't quite have the handling for yet. So it's an extra step in the process. And with that, I will unceremoniously end my talk. So thank you. We have like 3 minutes for questions if anyone does have a question.
The question I have for you is Charles Lapierre from Benetech. When the content actually has design elements like HTML summary details where a user could click on something and it expands and gives you additional information, how does that work in this free flow design?
So that's a good question, and it depends how you're handling that sort of clicking and expanding thing. I think, it's not, like reflow, as I showed, was built into a lot of these things that already exist. So if you're using the box method, what would need to happen is it would actually need to re-chunk the content again to show it. I think that's a situation where the column method actually might be better because you are doing a lot of fast changes that the reader needs to see really quickly. Because you're working with the browser, you also have a lot of options to use JavaScript built-in stuff like pop-ups and that sort of thing. So you're not hampered by a reading system. You're looking at everything that the web browser supports, which is a lot more. You have a lot more options for surfacing extra content to users.
As a screen reader user, a ton of questions come to mind. So if this is all going to display in the browser, are any of the tools that you mentioned for creating this HTML content, would they be aware of screen readers and able to say, for example, don't read the page number on every page and don't read the header on every page?
We'll start there. That's a really great question. I only have 15 seconds left, so essentially, because it's HTML, you can add any extra instructions that are already built in around accessibility. So you could add to your page numbers and to your running headers rules to say screen readers shouldn't read this. I don't think any of the existing e-reading system or pagination systems that I showed you have that built in, but it's something that could really easily be added by a developer with some very simple JavaScript. And again, because it's all on the web, you have all of the accessibility tools and options that the web has. Okay, I have to stop. But please come to me afterwards and ask questions. Okay.